Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. Now, anyone who's been watching for a while knows I love to answer questions. I don't mind taking tough questions, off-the-wall questions, any kind to help with the promotion of education and critical thinking. It has been a while since I had a questions video, so I took some time and I ended up finding a short from a channel called Brother Maverick. I don't know if this guy is saying he's unorthodox, maybe even the opposite of orthodox. Or maybe he's calling himself a guy who acts free from restraints or organizational guidelines. Or maybe his name is Maverick, I don't know. My name is Dark, so it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case. Anyway, Brother Maverick here seems to have a question that stumped an atheist. How do I know? Well, the short is titled, Christian Stumps Atheist with One Question. I don't know about the exclamation point there. Maybe he's excited about it because he doesn't stump many people? I don't know. But let's make some predictions, shall we? Take a moment and type in the comments what you think the question is going to be. I'll give you a hint. It's about the Bible. I know that isn't much of a hint, but you'll see. Anyway, I'll wait a few seconds so you can type it up. Okay, everyone got their guesses? Let's see what one question Brother Maverick asked to stump one atheist.
The Bible is made up of 66 books, written over 1,500 years.
I definitely don't want to harp on this, so I can grant that the Bible is made up of 66 books for a majority of Christian sects. But it depends on which sect and which Bible you are talking about. According to earlychristiantext.com, quote, the Ethiopian Bible, which is perhaps the oldest Christian Bible, includes somewhere between 81 to 84 books, depending on different factors. The Roman Catholic Bible has 73 books. And the Greek Orthodox Bible, without an official number, is somewhat larger, with a range between 75 and 79 books. The Syriac Bible also has a wide range of different books, and the Protestant Bible, which in some ways American culture prioritizes, has 66 books, 39 of an Old Testament and 27 of a New Testament. If one could total all the books in these different collections, there would be a total of around 100 books. Far more than the 27 books of the Christian New Testament and the range of 5 to 39 books in the Hebrew Bible, end quote. So I'm going to proceed with the notion that this content creator is some flavor of Protestant, and when he says the Bible, he means his version, which is some version of the Protestant Bible.
By 40 different writers, from different backgrounds, on 3 different continents.
Now I have to stop him right here. What he is doing is making this seem way more impressive than it actually is. I'm not going to go into the different writers' claims, as we don't know who actually wrote some of the books, but we do have church tradition to attribute books to certain authors, such as the Book of Mark to Mark, even though we don't know if the specific person called Mark actually wrote that book. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here, but just to be doubly sure, I checked on BibleVice.com for their books of the Bible and their authors complete list page. I'm going to refer to this if I need to. What I won't allow him to get away with is his claim that it was written on 3 different continents. Now, if I were to grant that this is a true statement, it sounds rather impressive, as continents are really big. But let's examine what this actually means. Here's a picture showing where each book of the Bible was written. Now, I went on a whole deep dive on the distance from Rome to Jerusalem, walking speed, and traveling on horseback, which I know that horses were more of a Roman thing, but I also went on traveling on donkeys and a bunch of other things. Thanks, ADHD. And roughly estimated the walk from Rome to Jerusalem would take about a month or so. Of course, the Bible doesn't have anything take place in the city of Rome, with the exception of Paul's journey from Malta to Rome and his ministry there at the end of Acts. In fact, with the exception of Revelation attributed to John towards the end of his life, every single book that was written on the continent of Europe was likely written by Paul or someone likely traveling with Paul at the time. So one traveling party wrote everything that was written on Europe, again with the exception of the one book written within 40 miles of the coast of Turkey. But okay, technically that is still Europe. No one debates that other books were likely written in Israel, which is in Asia, so no question there. Finally, the first 5 books were likely written not by Moses, as he very likely didn't exist. But even granting that he did, even though he would have had to write about his own death in Deuteronomy 34, 1-12, so I don't think so. The books were very likely written on the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt, but that part is in Asia. This picture just says the wilderness, so we don't know where they actually were written, though like I said, most sources I found said they were actually written on the Sinai Peninsula. Now, if he actually means that the events in the Bible supposedly took place on 3 continents, then sure. Very briefly, the story of the Exodus, which we also believe likely didn't happen, begins with the Israelites living in Goshen. According to Exodus 12:37, the Israelites set out from Ramses, a city in the region of Goshen, when they left Egypt. According to the maps I could find, Ramses was around 12 miles from Asia, so technically that is in Africa. Paul was in Rome twice according to BibleStudy.org, so I will grant that these things technically happened on 3 continents. Though, with the exceptions of the writing of Paul and the people traveling with him, as well as some of John's, everything that happened in the Bible is contained within this little circle. So this really isn't that impressive of a claim. This would be akin to saying, I walked to 4 US states in 30 seconds. Yeah, that sounds like someone was walking really fast, until you realize that there's a place called the Four Corners Monument, where the corners of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado meet. So where is the delineation between Africa, Asia, and Europe? The best I can say is somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. Here's the map with a scale. Somewhere around here would be the closest we have to what would be considered a 3 corners boundary of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Not very far from most of the Bible, right? The point is that he brings up that it was written on 3 continents to paint this image that these suggested authors were so far away from each other, when really they were all in very close proximity to Israel, at least at some time. So it wouldn't be surprising that people wrote similar stories when they were mostly in the same region as the other stories. That was a bit long, and I looked into it for about 4 hours. I'm giving you the majorly condensed form of what I found.
Obviously, before social media, before contact, before these people even knew each other or knew of each other.
This is straight up not true. In the mythology, the people of the Bible often had knowledge of earlier figures and events, even if they were separated by significant periods. This knowledge typically came through oral traditions, written texts, and supposed divine revelation. Here are some examples. Stories and teachings were passed down through generations. For instance, the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were well known to later Israelites through oral traditions and eventually through written records such as the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Many biblical characters refer to their ancestors or significant events from the past. For example, Moses knew of the patriarchs and God's covenant with them. Joshua referred to Moses and his leadership. David referred to the covenant with Abraham and God's work with Moses. Later prophets and kings frequently reference earlier events and figures. For example, Isaiah and other prophets spoke of the Exodus and the covenant with Abraham. Ezra and Nehemiah read and interpreted the laws of Moses to the people after the Babylonian exile. In the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples were well versed in the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus often referenced Moses, David, Isaiah, and other prophets. In some instances, knowledge of the past came through supposed divine revelation. For instance, God reminded prophets of earlier covenants and events, such as God's reminders to the prophets of his covenant with Abraham and the Exodus. So the people of the Bible were often aware of each other and past events through various means, especially through oral and written traditions. This interconnectedness helps to shape their understanding of their identity, their history, and their relationship with this God of their mythology.
Didn't know that the other person was writing scripture or writing any parts of what even back then wasn't known as the Bible. They were just writing what God told them to write.
The assertion that biblical authors were unaware of each other's writings is blatantly not true. At absolute best, Brother Maverick is ignorant or overlooking significant historical, textual, and theological evidence. Let me break this down for a bit. First, 2 things about the Synoptic Gospels. It is widely accepted among scholars that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark as a source. This theory, known as the synoptic problem, highlights that Matthew and Luke contain large portions of text directly from Mark, sometimes word for word. This indicates that the authors of Matthew and Luke were not only aware of Mark's Gospel, but also saw it as an authoritative source worthy of inclusion and expansion in their own accounts. Additionally, many scholars propose the existence of a hypothetical document called Q, from the German Quelle, meaning source, which contains sayings of Jesus that were found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. This further supports the idea of the Gospel writers had access to common sources and were aware of each other's writings. But how about some Old Testament references? The New Testament writers frequently reference the Old Testament, indicating their deep familiarity with these texts. For instance, Matthew's Gospel includes numerous references to Old Testament prophecies to demonstrate that Mr. Jesus is the fulfillment of these prophecies, e.g. Matthew 1:22-23, citing Isaiah 7:14. Paul's letters are replete with quotations and allusions to the Old Testament. For example, in Romans 4, Paul discusses the faith of Abraham, drawing directly from Genesis. This shows a conscious effort to connect the new Christian teachings with the established Hebrew scriptures. But what about the epistles in early Christian communities? Paul's letters, the epistles, were not written in isolation. They were circulated among early Christian communities. Colossians 4:16 mentions, "After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea." This practice indicates that early Christians were aware of multiple writings and saw them as important for teaching and edification. In 2 Peter 3:15-16, Peter refers to Paul's letters, acknowledging their wisdom and the fact that some people distort them, just as they do the other scriptures. This demonstrates a recognition of Paul's letters as having scriptural authority even during the time of their writing. What about with historical and theological continuity? The Jewish tradition of meticulous transmission of texts carried over into early Christianity. This careful copying and preservation of texts, combined with the shared oral traditions, ensured that the writers were aware of and respected existing scriptures. The writings of the early church fathers, such as Irenaeus and Tertullian, provide evidence that by the end of the first century and the beginning of the second, there was a clear awareness of the authoritative status of many New Testament writings. They quoted extensively from the Gospels and epistles, treating them as scripture. So the very notion that biblical authors were unaware of each other's writings does not hold up against the substantial evidence of interdependence among the texts, the use of established scriptures, and the practices of early Christian communities. The interconnectedness of biblical writings reflects a coherent and conscious effort to convey a unified message grounding in a shared faith tradition. If any atheist is stumped by any of this, it is because they don't know the history, which is fine. I would argue that most atheists don't care enough to dive this deep. Let's just move on.
So how do you reconcile the fact that those authors were not only from not the same continent, but not the same culture, not even the same time period?
Finally, we're at the titular question. How do we reconcile the cough cough fact that the authors were from different continents, cultures, and time periods? To reconcile the fact that the authors of the Bible came from these different continents, cultures, and time periods, we can consider several naturalistic factors that contribute to the coherence and unity of the text. How about cultural interchange? The ancient Near East and Mediterranean regions were connected through trade routes, military campaigns, and diplomatic relations. This facilitated the exchange of ideas, stories, and cultural practices across different societies. The spread of Hellenistic culture after the conquest of Alexander the Great created a common cultural and intellectual environment. Greek became the lingua franca, which allowed for the easier exchange of texts and ideas. As for historical continuity, the Israelites, who produced much of the Old Testament, had a continuous cultural and religious tradition that was preserved and transmitted through successive generations. This community helped maintain a coherent narrative despite the passage of time. The New Testament was written during the Roman Empire, which provided a unified political and social structure. This environment supported the rapid dissemination and preservation of texts. Let's look at literary techniques. Many books of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, are compilations of earlier sources and traditions. Editors and scribes played a crucial role in shaping these texts to create a consistent narrative. For instance, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is believed to be a product of multiple sources that were redacted over time. This would be the documentary hypothesis. The Bible explores universal themes such as morality, human suffering, and the search for meaning. These themes resonate across different cultures and times, contributing to the sense of unity. What about the idea of influence and adaptation? As I talked at length before, later biblical authors were influenced by earlier texts. They often referenced and built upon existing stories and prophecies. For example, New Testament writers frequently quoted or alluded to the Old Testament, creating a sense of continuity. Biblical authors adapted their message to the specific cultural and historical contexts. This adaptability allowed the core message to remain relevant and coherent even as the surrounding circumstances changed. Finally, I want to touch on that oral tradition. Before being written down, many biblical stories were transmitted orally. Oral tradition has a way of preserving core narratives and values while allowing for flexibility in details. This oral transmission helped maintain a unified message over time and across different communities. By considering these factors, we can understand how the Bible, despite being written by authors from different continents, cultures, and time periods, exhibits some level of coherence and continuity. The interconnectedness of the ancient world, the role of editors and compilers, and universal themes addressed in the text all contribute to this idea. There is my answer. Now let's see how this atheist responds.
I highly doubt that was the case. I couldn't imagine corroborating stories from separate continents about the same guy that claims to have been God. I don't know. I'm at a loss for this one because it's quite a large claim.
Yep, this can be a large claim, and it seems like this atheist was caught off guard by this. Of course, anyone unprepared for this question may find it a bit tough to come up with an on-the-spot answer. I think he was heading in the right direction. Let me try to break down his answer a little bit and why he may have thought like he did, though he expressed it quite poorly. Now, to be fair, I don't know who this person is. He may be an atheist, he may not be an atheist, I don't know his scholarly credentials, but let's see what he could have been trying to say. He may be skeptical of claims that span different continents and cultures, especially extraordinary claims about a person claiming to be a god. From a naturalistic perspective, such claims would require substantial evidence to be considered credible. He might be trying to point out that there is a lack of contemporary historical corroboration from non-biblical sources about the events and claims described in the Bible. This absence of external verification can raise doubts about the accuracy and reliability of the biblical accounts. The diversity of religious and mythological beliefs worldwide could lead to skepticism about the uniqueness of the biblical narrative. Many cultures have their own divine or semi-divine figures, and from this perspective, the biblical claims may be seen as one among many. Integrating diverse accounts from different times and places can be challenging. People might struggle to reconcile how stories about Mr. Jesus originating in different cultural contexts and written decades apart can form a coherent and consistent narrative. The claim that Mr. Jesus claimed to be a god, and the events described in the Bible, such as miracles and the resurrection, are extraordinary. From a skeptical standpoint, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Without compelling evidence, skepticism naturally arises. Considering the context, it might also lead anyone watching to skepticism about whether the response was genuine or staged. In discussions or debates, sometimes responses are framed to provoke a specific discussion or reaction, rather than genuinely reflecting the person's beliefs. If I were to take what I think he's trying to say and put into a clear response, now remember that I've had time to investigate and formulate my sentences how I wanted to, so if this person is genuine, no disrespect to him, please. This is probably how I would word it. I find it difficult to accept the idea that stories about the same person claiming to be God could be reliably corroborated across different continents and cultures. It's not just a matter of geological separation, but also the vast differences in beliefs, customs, and historical contexts. Without contemporaneous sources outside of religious texts, it is challenging to verify the accuracy of such extraordinary claims. The diversity of religious beliefs worldwide suggests that many cultures have their own divine figures and narratives, which raises questions about the uniqueness and universal truth claims of any particular religious tradition. Moreover, integrating stories written decades apart and originating in different cultural settings into a coherent narrative requires careful consideration of how these accounts were transmitted and interpreted over time. As a skeptic, I approach claims of divine revelation and miraculous events with caution, as they demand robust evidence to warrant belief. And that's the end of the video. So let's look at that question again. How do you reconcile the fact that those authors were not only from not the same continent, but not the same culture, not even the same time period? What do you think? Do you think this is a good question? I would admit that on its surface, it is better than many others I've heard. But let's take a closer look. Brother Maverick's question seems to imply that the coherence and unity of the Bible, despite its authors coming from different continents, cultures, and time periods, cannot be adequately explained without invoking the existence of a divine entity, presumably their God. The underlying argument could be summarized with 3 points. He seems to be suggesting that given the diversity and separation of the biblical authors in terms of geography, culture, and time, it is difficult to explain how their writings could converge on a unified message without some form of divine guidance or intervention. In essence, they are positing that the complexity and unity of the Bible exceed what humans could naturally achieve. By highlighting these apparent obstacles, different continents, cultures, time periods, He is implicitly suggesting that a supernatural force, his God, must have played a role in ensuring the coherence and continuity of the biblical texts. This aligns with the common theological belief that the Bible is divinely inspired and that its unity across diverse human contexts is evidence of its divine origin. While he may not explicitly state it as an argument from ignorance or incredulity, the reasoning follows a similar pattern, asserting that because we cannot fully explain or reconcile something, that is the unity of the Bible across diversity, a supernatural explanation, being God's intervention, must be true. In response, we can argue that this reasoning at least could be fallacious if it dismisses potential naturalistic explanations or fails to consider alternative hypotheses. We could critically examine whether the coherence of the Bible necessitates a supernatural explanation or if naturalistic factors, such as cultural exchange, oral tradition, editing processes, and shared historical context, could sufficiently account for it, thus not violating Occam's razor. That's it for this one. So what do you think? Did you guess the question right? Were you stumped by the question? Or did the answers come to you as if they were divinely inspired? Let me know in the comments below. I had planned for this to be a shorter video, but that deep dive into when and where the Bible was written had me on an adventure. If you appreciate the journey that this single question took us on, hit that like button. Though you can get more educational content beamed directly to your YouTubes as though if it were sent by some supernatural force by hitting that subscribe if you haven't already. Speaking of supernatural forces, I have to give special thanks to my patrons, Claminus Anima, Sora, Long-Haired Lefty, Musical Ocelot, Ooga Booga Luga, Anonymous Netizen, Tarek Alkasab, Jamabomb, Kai Henningsen, and Triple Towel. If you would like to sufficiently account for my channel, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. I am working hard to bring more quality content to all of you, and every single bit of support helps. Thank you so much for this. And as always, keep learning.